I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. These are the ominous and foreboding words spoken by Robert Oppenheimer, the father of the nuclear bomb, as he witnessed the first ever nuclear explosion. Although the prospects of nuclear annihilation may seem like a distant sci fi fantasy, this is not so. In light of our current global political climate, such a reality may be closer than we care to admit. Although I am not a nuclear physicist, my research on atomic weaponry has left me in awe of their devastating potential, and the need to inform you about it truly felt imperative. So today I shall be speaking to you about nuclear weapons. We will discuss the way in which these weapons work and their effects. Let us begin with a brief overview of how these weapons operate. The way in which nuclear weapons work is unique and truly marks them as significant. The first step in understanding how they operate is to know how an atom is split. But first, let us remind ourselves of the anatomy of the atom. We see here that the nucleus is composed of protons and neutrons. They are surrounded by an electron cloud, but it is with protons and neutrons that the nucleus of the atom that we are concerned with. In a 2019 article published by the American Physical Society, we are given a bit of historical context. They tell us that after years of preceding research, finally in 1932, the first atoms were split by firing high energy protons into the nuclei of various elements. But the energy released from splitting these atoms was simply too little. That is, until other physicists years later discovered a process known as nuclear fission. But what is this process and how does it work? In a 2014 article, the Atomic Heritage Museum describes fission as a process that occurs when a neutron strikes the nucleus of an atom, as we see here. So neutrons strike the nucleus of an atom. This nucleus then separates into multiple nuclei. More neutrons are released. They further strike nuclei, and a chain reaction develops, which is how an atomic explosion occurs. But not all atomic weapons use this process. Thermonuclear weapons, better known as hydrogen bombs, use a totally different process by a similar sounding name. It is known as nuclear fusion. A 2005 PBS article describes nuclear fusion as the process of forming a heavier nucleus from two lighter ones, as we see in this animation here. For this to occur, however, very high temperatures are needed. So to achieve this, what first happens is a fission or atom bomb is exploded, and then the fusion bomb explodes. This creates what the Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation calls a positive feedback loop between fission and fusion, which results in an explosion hundreds of thousands of times more powerful than an atomic bomb. Now that we understand just how these weapons operate, let's delve into some of their effects. The effects are terrible and multifaceted, and they come in a series. The first one in the series is the blast wave, as we can see in this image here, and as the Atomic Archive informs us, upon detonation, a wall of highly compressed air moves away from the explosion, causing physical blast damage to any item or anyone in its path. Following the blast wave, the next effect is thermal radiation. The Atomic Archive goes on to tell us that the temperature of an atomic explosion reaches that of the interior of the sun. And also like the sun, and as we can see here, a fireball is produced by the detonation. This fireball pulses in radiation. It pulses twice, and the first one only produces ultraviolet radiation, but the second one produces thermal radiation that actually causes damage and causes things to set on fire. The next effect after that is nuclear radiation, of which there are two types. The first, being quite minor of the two, is known as initial radiation, which occurs immediately after detonation and lasts for a short period of time. The second, known as residual nuclear radiation, comes from radioactive fallout, which is all the radioactive material that falls from the sky as a direct result of the explosion. Finally, there are long-term effects to consider. In terms of human health, for example, effects may appear years later and vary widely. Japan, for instance, has data that indicates that after the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there were significant increases in blood disorders, cataracts, malignant tumors, keloids, and cancers. Here is an example of a woman with keloids, a skin disorder. In addition to health effects, we must examine the implications of infrastructural damage. For example, nuclear detonations release EMPs, electromagnetic pulses, that disrupt power grids. And if this were to occur, important sectors such as the medical sectors, transportational, communication sectors would all be impacted severely. And this would, of course, result in a loss of life, but also harm the economy. Now, in addition to that, we must also consider ecological effects. For example, nuclear explosions create um, a lot of nitric oxide, a naturally occurring gas, but the quantities of this nitric oxide is so great that once it rises to the atmosphere, it eats away at the ozone layer, which further brings harm to the Earth and to all living creatures on it. Now that we have discussed some of the detrimental effects of nuclear weapons, their apocalyptic nature is made undeniably evident. In closing, after discussing the way in which these weapons operate, their devastating effects, it is clear that nuclear weapons are indeed the most dangerous and destructive tools in the human arsenal, bearing the potential to eradicate life on Earth. Such is the reality of nuclear warfare. As we ponder it, let us also think of the words of author Joseph Cannon in his novel Los Alamos. This was the secret, he said. Annihilation. Nothing else. Now we would always be frightened.